You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is acclaimed author David Rohl. He has written several books, including the definitive biography of George Marshall called Defender of the Republic. Another book which I have purchased but haven't read, and it's called The Hopkins Touch. It's about Harry Hopkins, the famed counselor or advisor to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But today we're talking about his latest effort. And if you're a fan of 20th century, mid-20th century history, this apogee of partnerships that happened in World War II and slightly after, pick up Mr. Rohl's new book. It's called Ascent to Power: How Truman Emerged from Roosevelt's Shadow and Remade the World. Mr. Rohl, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
May I throw you a little bit of a curveball to get started?
Uh-oh.
I have asked several guests on the podcast this question, and I'm asking it of you because I asked George Will this question, and I asked Mitch Daniels, if you're familiar with former Governor Daniels of Indiana, this question, and the first name they came up with was George Marshall. So,
wow.
If you could construct a new Mount Rushmore of the most impactful Americans who were never president, whom would you choose?
Well, obviously Marshall. I think without a doubt, there can be no doubt in terms of his importance, his impact, his character. There's very few flaws associated with George Marshall. Are you saying not that haven't been presidents?
Correct.
The guy that was Wilson's consigliere.
Oh, Colonel Edward House.
Edward House is probably very influential and important. And I have to say that Hopkins, in terms of the Roosevelt administration, was key to helping actually starting the alliance that won World War II, and basically Roosevelt's legs with Churchill and Stalin. I can't overemphasize his importance. And of course, I wrote the book about it. Probably, I don't know as much about Lincoln as probably you do, but somebody in his cabinet probably was the most influential, could have been. And that's Doris Kearns Goodwin's team of rivals, very important people. And another guy that I ran into in working on the current book is Jimmy Burns.
Oh, yeah.
Who actually was in all three parts of the United States government. He was Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. He was a senator. He was a congressman. And he was the so-called assistant president for a while with Truman until they separated. He probably would have been vice president instead of Truman if he wasn't a segregationist and if he had the support of labor. And Roosevelt actually wanted him to be for a while. He promised him actually the vice president slot.
Correct. Let's talk a little bit. I love the subtitle of your book. We're talking with David Rohl, author of Ascent to Power. The subtitle of your book is How Truman Emerged from Roosevelt's Shadow and Remade the World. So let's bifurcate that a little bit. How did Truman emerge from Roosevelt's shadow?
I think that the moment came in the midterms, 1946, when the disaster for the Democrats. We're talking about the midterms, 1946. So the Senate and the House changed from Democrat to Republican for the first time since 1928. So Truman at that point had to deal with the opposition, Taft being the primary opponent. But it was a relief. I argue in my book, there was a transformation of Truman. He felt free. He felt like a free man after that devastating defeat by the Democrats. And his communicator, I guess you would call him, said that from henceforth, this is a new administration. And so he felt free to start pressing on things that Roosevelt would not have done, like civil rights. And civil rights began right before the midterms. He appointed a commission on civil rights, a very serious commission, unlike anything Roosevelt had ever done. So I think that sort of released a lot of things. The Truman Doctrine came after that, the Marshall Plan, the NATO, everything with a Republican-controlled Congress.
At the second part, how did Harry, and then we'll go back in time a little bit, but I want to cover this. Yeah. How did Harry Truman remake the world?
It's the speech that he gave, which was called the Truman Doctrine. And it was a speech in which he proclaimed the policy of the United States is to assist, support democracies wherever they may be throughout the world that are being assaulted or undermined or challenged by, never used the word Soviet Union, but that's what he was talking about. And they were the Greece and Turkey. And in a sense, it was the same thing that we're now asserting, although now it's in trouble, the idea of supporting Ukraine. So there's a similarity. There was not a war in Greece, not a war in Turkey that he was concerned about in 1947 and 48, but the communists were on the march in Greece, and the Kremlin was putting pressure on Turkey concerning the Black Sea Treaty.
Is that the treaty that kept them out of the straits?
Yes.
The dark. Yeah.
Yes. And he used that, and Dean Acheson was very critically important in helping to write that speech. It was, at first, everybody was flummoxed. What is going on here? It was a radical change in the foreign policy. And it's lasted until now. It really is. And the rationale for it is national security. If we don't, and Acheson was the one who formulated the domino theory, although he called it apples in a rotten barrel or something like that. But it was the beginning of the domino kind of theory. Get them, stop the assault over there because it's going to come here.
Is there the legend of Harry Truman? Besides, he served in World War I. He was a failed haberdasher. He was let's just say, a benefitor of the Pendergrass political machine. He gets elected to the Senate, comes to prominence because he chairs the Senate committee that oversees or investigates government spending or waste, that sort of thing.
Right.
1944 at the convention, after a little bit of a struggle, maybe more than a little bit of a struggle, Senator Harry Truman is put on the ticket with Franklin Roosevelt when President Roosevelt runs for a fourth term. Truman was his third vice president. How did Truman manage to win that nomination, and subsequent events? Roosevelt dies April 12th of 45.
Right.
Has there been anyone else less prepared to assume the presidency than Truman in April of 45?
There must have been, but
Andrew Johnson, maybe?
Yeah, it in a sense, you're talking about Teddy Roosevelt when McKinley shot. He obviously must have been more prepared than Truman, being what he was at that point. So I think that they call Truman an accidental president, but I don't think he was. I argue that Roosevelt's death was expected. It really,
that was very interesting. You made that point in the book. Forgive me for just interjecting very quickly. And I thought that was very bold of you. And I hadn't read it. Everyone talks about him being in President Roosevelt being in ill health, especially people who saw him at Yalta, hadn't seen him for a while in February of 45. But in your book, you're like, look, no one expects him to complete this fourth term. So the VP is even more important, and it can't be Henry Wallace.
Yeah, his doctors told Roosevelt that he would not survive the fourth term, but he ran anyway. But it was an open secret in Washington, I assert, that he was going to die, that he was not long for life. Truman actually said that to a friend, and which I have a source to in a footnote in. Truman said to his friend that physically Roosevelt had gone to pieces. So now Truman saw Roosevelt very infrequently, but the word was out. And so I would argue that he was not an accidental president. And he knew that Roosevelt was in deep trouble in terms of his health. Meanwhile, he made no effort whatsoever to try to get into the foreign policy, particularly. He knew a lot about the domestic issues, but foreign policy he knew nothing about, except, and I say this in the book, and I think that most people think otherwise, when Roosevelt invited Truman for a photo op and a lunch after he was appointed vice president in August, a hot day in August 1944, Roosevelt told Truman about the existence of the bomb. Now, everybody thinks that he didn't know anything about the bomb. He did, because of his committee. And I have an oral history that supports that point, as well as other sources. And in fact, Truman did know about the existence. He knew about the Manhattan Project.
Correct.
He knew about the bomb. Everybody in his investigators, all of his investigators knew about the bomb.
The common story is that he wasn't told about it in detail until after Roosevelt dies, and Secretary of War Stimson says, "Hey, I got to tell you about something."
But Roosevelt did not give him details at that lunch, but he did tell him about the existence of the bomb. There's no recorded conversation, but that in fact happened then. The other thing that Truman could have done is he could have hired a foreign policy expert, an ex-State Department person, or he could have gone to the State Department and talked to people there to try to get up to speed. Now, the State Department probably was in the dark about a lot of stuff at Yalta and Tehran, but that's what Truman really needed to know. And he didn't try. And of course, Roosevelt didn't do anything. The most he did was tell him about the existence of the bomb, and that was it.
How did Harry Truman find out about the death of Franklin Roosevelt?
He was in the Senate that day in the afternoon of April 12th. And as the Senate, he was writing letters up on the dais because he was presiding over the Senate. There was some sort of argument going on, but he was really writing letters at the point. He was bored. And after they adjourned, he went over to the House side to have a libation with,
as he was known to do.
And that the famous parliamentarian was in the room. Drexler was, I think was the name, probably a legendary parliamentarian was in the room. But anyway, I think it was Elsie made a phone call to knowing that Truman would be there. And so Truman got on the phone, took the call, and the caller said, "Get to the White House immediately." And Truman put down the phone and he said, "Jesus Christ," and General Jackson.
Yeah.
And he knew, I believe he knew that Roosevelt had died. This was not something, they said, "Get here immediately." So he had to run back all the way across, back to the Senate to get his driver. And he didn't alert the Secret Service people at all. And they got there quickly. And that's when he went upstairs and Eleanor Roosevelt informed him and actually told him that he was in trouble.
Yeah. I always like how she delivered those lines. She very succinctly said, "Harry, the president is dead." And then when he asked her if there was anything that he can do for her, Mr. Roll, her response was,
"What can we do for you? You're the one in trouble."
Truman came on as president in the most, I would argue, the most unique situation in American history, other than perhaps Washington creating the office of the president. And by that, no other time in American history had there been a president for so long. Roosevelt was inaugurated in 33 in March. He dies in April of 45, 12 years. You have an entire generation of folks who only knew Franklin Roosevelt as president. They were accustomed to his voice, his mannerisms, his wit, his character. Talk for just a minute, please, about the shoes that Harry Truman stepped into on that fateful April day.
Look at just imagine what he was facing the moment he became president. And the moment was the death of Roosevelt after 12 years. A global war. They were still fighting the Germans. It was winding down, and they had the Japanese to deal with. A global war and an increasingly hostile Soviet Union. The advent, the nuclear age, they called it the atomic age. Raging inflation and many other lesser problems, but no one inherited that kind of a workload, let's put it that way, and knew less about it, at least the foreign relations part of it, than Harry Truman. So it was a huge burden on his shoulders immediately. How to wind down the war with the Germans, what to do about the existence of the bomb. And the inflation, it was, of course, there's a parallel here with the coming election that we're having now. How to deal with inflation. No one knows exactly how to deal with it.
He also had the latent crisis, which wasn't boiling like the ones you just said, but it was simmering. And that was what to do about civil rights for Black Americans,
right.
Especially in light of and in relation to their service in wartime.
Yeah. And just to give a little background on that, both sets of Harry Truman's grandparents were slave owners, enslaved people. He used the N-word. He grew up in Missouri, a slave state. And his mother would not, when she came to the White House, would not sleep in the Lincoln room. And anything Lincoln, having to do with Lincoln, she just wouldn't have anything to do with him. Imagine with that background, he started his civil rights, I think, revelations when he was a senator. He made a famous speech in Sedalia, Missouri, about the brotherhood of man. That was what he began it with. And so a transformation occurred when he was a senator. But in 1946, he enlisted a commission to make a report on civil rights. And he put a CEO, I think it was a CEO of GE, in charge, a gentleman that really was ahead of his time. But there were a lot of civil rights activists on that commission also. And so and when the report came out in 1948, it was a bombshell. And then he had some meetings with Walter White, and this is something that I've written more about in the book than many places in biographies of Truman. But he and Walter White got along great. Walter White was the head of the NAACP. And the first major speech by a president, it's not just the first big speech by a president since Lincoln was Truman in June of 1947, when he appeared at the Lincoln Memorial along with Eleanor Roosevelt. And he gave a speech on the Lincoln Memorial to 10,000 people. It was the NAACP's annual meeting. And he proclaimed his commitment, the commitment of the federal government to civil rights. Now, Truman was not the kind of civil rights person that we have today, because he had some reservations about it. And I write about that. He did not believe in the social equality of, back then they called them the Negroes. And that meant sports teams and neighborhoods and clubs and stuff like that. And so he vacillated sometimes about civil rights. But when he spoke with a resounding commitment, of course, all he really accomplished during his time as president was two things. Aside from being a voice in favor of civil rights, he, by executive order, tried to integrate the Army. He proclaimed that the Army or the armed forces should be integrated. And he also proclaimed that federal employees must be not discriminated against. But in other words, no discrimination in the workplace for the employees. And similar to the Army, no discrimination on the Army bases and in the foxholes. But the blacks were still facing discrimination throughout America. 80% of the people in America objected to Truman's civil rights program. But it was a huge deal nevertheless, even though he tried to get laws passed and so forth, and of course was blocked by the South.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest today is acclaimed author David L. Rohl. We're discussing his latest book, Ascent to Power: How Truman Emerged from Roosevelt's Shadow and Remade the World. Very few presidents have had to make the quality, the level of decision that President Truman had to make, starting very quickly. Again, he becomes president in April of 45. On April 1st, 1945, the invasion of Okinawa begins.
Mm-hmm.
A few months later, on July 16th, 1945, he's informed that the atomic bomb test at White Sands Missile Range, where I was stationed in the Army, it's a wonderful place. The test is successful there at Trinity Site. Now he has to decide, is he going to authorize the use of the atomic bombs on Japan? In everything that I've read, and I'm going to overstate this, Mr. Rohl, so tell me I'm wrong. It doesn't seem like he has a whole lot of angst over it. Like, we've got the weapon. It can save American lives. The Japanese are proven to fight to the death. 1 million casualties or whatever are being forecasted. My understanding is that they were still handing out Purple Hearts during Vietnam that were ordered before the supposed American invasion of Japan. That's how many casualties they expected. Yep. Harry Truman seemed to have taken that decision to use the atomic bombs matter-of-factly, resolutely, and never looked back. Is that a fair characterization?
I think so. I really do. He never really made, and I argued this in my book, a real decision. And I think this is part of Roosevelt's shadow existed, I think, at that point. And I think he regarded the bomb as Roosevelt's unspoken legacy. All of the national security people in the administration at the time, he first was informed when he was at Potsdam that it would work. But that if he made a decision, it was a decision to not say no. He was the only one who could have said no and made it stick. So he could have done that. And Leslie Groves said his decision was one of non-interference. Leslie Groves being the head of the
right.
And is there an actual decision, or did he just say, we have to do this because of the flower of American mankind? He regarded it as, he said, at one point he said, it was worth two cities. It was worth two cities to save the lives of tens of thousands of Americans. That was his rationale, and that's what he stuck with. And I think the portrayal of Truman in the Oppenheimer movie was a farce. It was certainly not Truman. But he balanced the American lives against it. Now, and I think that justified, in his mind, Hiroshima. He could have waited longer with Nagasaki because they were trying to get the Japanese to surrender.
Correct.
And the question is, and they didn't surrender after Hiroshima. They didn't. And days went by, and finally he said, okay, he did authorize Nagasaki, or he didn't say no about Nagasaki. And that was planned. They would do another one. But
let me ask a true or false question. Did President Truman call J. Robert Oppenheimer a crybaby and say don't ever bring him back into this office?
I don't have a source for that. I don't know. Certainly it's not in my book. Maybe there's a source somewhere but I think it's right that he did not want to listen to somebody second guess the whole situation. What he called him, he could have. He's like that when he would say, "Get that son of a bitch out of here." Yeah, that's the way he talked. And he did that with Morgenthau. He did that with a lot of people. It may be in Evan Thomas's book. I'm not sure.
The one thing that is, as you read this book, and we're talking with David Rohl, author of Ascent to Power: How Truman Emerged from Roosevelt's Shadow and Remade the World. It's when we talk about Truman's decisions, the initiatives, NATO, Berlin Airlift, Marshall Plan, we have to be sure, I have to be sure, not to read those in the context of 2024 or the last 50 years. In other words, of course we did these things. We've always done these things.
Yeah.
Talk for a minute, please. Tell the Leaders and Legends podcast audience, in your view, how big of a historical departure, or diplomatic, military, economic too, were these Truman-led, to give him credit a little bit, Truman-led initiatives after World War II that fed the Europeans, told the Russians not to move any farther, and involved us in international affairs in a way that would have made George Washington spin?
I think these were the most consequential things in American history. The idea that in the space of 2 years, basically, you get the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, all of those done, plus the detonation of the atomic bombs on top of it all, were just remarkable. And the idea, the people that he had, Marshall, Atchison, Clark Clifford plays a huge role in developing the Truman Doctrine and actually helping him win the election in 1948. But Clark Clifford's role was really very important, impactful, and he was pushing Truman. He was really pushing Truman. Cliff would like to take credit for a lot of stuff that some of his people wrote, but he was the one who delivered it to Truman and convinced Truman to go all out on civil rights, on foreign policy, the Marshall Plan, and then, of course, he had George Marshall and a guy named Will Clayton, who really shaped the Marshall Plan and made it into basically a trade deal. That's my view. So we got to have trading partners in Europe or we're dead. Or otherwise, we're dealing with autocrats. So this whole situation was unprecedented, obviously unprecedented, but just an eruption, a volcano in the middle of 2 years after the war, post-war. And to me, it was so amazing and another thing I should point out, what America did in post-war is that we were like no other conquerors. We conquered Germany, we conquered Japan, and then we turned around in those 2 hours, in those maybe more than 2 years, maybe 3 or 4 years. We reversed the conquerors taking all of their property, basically overseeing. We energized their economy. We changed their economies. Germany became the engine house of Europe because of what we did. Japan, we reversed the entire situation in Japan, and Japan became our country in Asia, our national security base in Asia with a powerful economy. So what America did was basically take its enemies and turn them into economic powerhouses.
You mentioned Potsdam, the Big Three conference that happened in the summer of 45 after Germany had capitulated in May of 45. And President Truman got to see for himself the devastation of Germany, of what they brought on themselves, but the bombing and the hand-to-hand combat, he didn't see the combat, but he saw the results of it. How much do you think it influenced him when it came to things like the Marshall Plan or the Truman Doctrine, to see a once proud people living in rubble and literally starving to death?
Yeah, a lot. It was a big deal. And he took a tour when he got into Berlin in an open car and visited the Brandenburg Gate and all those things. But then he flew over it also and saw it from the air. And incidentally, while I was in Potsdam, he visited with Eisenhower at his headquarters. And he told Eisenhower that he would do anything he could for Eisenhower, including the presidency in 1948. Eisenhower kind of laughed and said, what do you mean? But he did. He said, if you want to be president in 1948, let me know. Later, they had a huge break.
Correct. You mentioned 48. We have a few minutes left with author David Rohl here on the Leaders and Legends podcast. You also talked a few minutes ago about the 1946 elections. The Republicans, after years and years of being in the wilderness, they capture the Senate, they capture the House. And I don't know that anyone would have been sanguine or optimistic about Harry Truman's political future at that point. But in 1948, he wins one of the great stunners. I don't know if it's an upset, but it sure was stunning victories in the history of American politics when he defeats former New York governor in 1940 and 1944 Republican nominee for president, Thomas E. Dewey. How was Truman and how did Truman pull that off at a time where Americans were worried about inflation, when Americans were trying to come to grips with their new place in the world, with this whole notion of atomic power? Yet Truman, it seemed like he won, and it's detailed wonderfully in your book, through sheer hard work.
Yeah, resilience. Yeah, he faced the Solid South was 12 states had formed a states' rights. Dixiecrats were against him. Wallace was running, and he had inflation. This is where Clifford was instrumental in this thing. And basically, Clifford advised that he not really go after Dewey, but he challenged the 80th Congress, which was dominated by the Republicans, of course, to really go after the 80th Congress in his speeches during his whistle-stop campaign. So that was a critical political choice that he made. He rarely mentioned, if ever, Dewey. The other thing was the black vote. They wanted the black vote to replace the loss of the South. No easy task. But as I write in the book, he enlisted some critically important African American people in Chicago. John Sangstrat, the head of the newspaper there, the black newspaper, and a congressman, Dawson, plus a woman named Anna Hedgeman, who nobody has ever written about, who assisted with two of the battleground states, Illinois and Ohio. Those were critical states during that election. And then there was a woman named India Edwards who handled the inflation issue, and which was tough, but they had the cost of beef was a real issue.
Yeah.
There was a meat short. Anyway, so she hired an African American activist to help deal with the black women and the grocery prices. So the black vote, some people feel that it was the black vote that brought him over the top in that election. Truman didn't say that, but what some of his advisors did. But attacking the 80th Congress, and I'll say one other thing about Truman on the stump. His whistle-stop campaign was a real roadshow. He was a showman. Let's say he played fast and loose with the truth. And when he spoke to the farmers in Iowa, Illinois, and Ohio, that he convinced the Ohioans, which was completely Republican. It was completely dominated by Republicans. He flipped it. He flipped Ohio. And his speech in Dexter, Iowa, was the most rollicking roadshow that you've ever seen. It was something like a Trump. It was like a Trump rally. Thousands and thousands of people. And he was claiming that the Republicans were going to stop price supports for the agriculture, which was untrue. And he got away with it. And then some of the reporters on the train said he was getting away with murder. So they liked him. He was he spent 10 years as a dirt farmer.
Yeah.
10 years as a dirt farmer. He knew how to plow. He knew how to talk to those people. And so he flipped the farm states, and that was unexpected. He lost all the industrial states in the Northeast. It was the West and the farmers and the black vote that took him over the top. And it was close. In fact, the pollsters, in a way, it was more surprising than the Trump victory, because the last week of the campaign for Truman, the pollsters weren't polling that thing. They stopped polling. And so no one knew that there was a sudden movement in the last few days toward Truman. Whereas in the Trump thing, everybody knew that Hillary and Trump were in a dead heat during the last few days. So anyway, one other thing I should point out, if we're talking about really important people in the whole scheme of things, and this goes back to the Marshall Plan and NATO and so forth, Senator Arthur Vandenberg from my state, Michigan, was a Republican. He was an isolationist up until the war. And then he became the head of the Foreign Relations Committee. And he worked hand in hand with Marshall and Truman. And he was the most important figure in helping this revolution that took place under Truman during those very few years after the war. Very important.
Revolution is the right term. Last question before we get to the 5 questions we ask all of our guests here on the Leaders and Legends podcast. I promise, Mr. Roll, they're harmless. The presidential reputations ebb and flow. 50 years ago, if you would have said, hey, people are reevaluating Ulysses S. Grant's presidency upward because of his fight against the Klan or some other things, that would have seemed to have been out of place. While at the same time, Woodrow Wilson, who was always in the top 5 to 7 in the ranking of presidents, his reputation has taken a significant beating in the last decade or two as we concentrate more on what he said and how he acted. Harry Truman, how would you, as a historian, assess history's judgment of Truman?
I think probably he's about in the 5th place in my ranking, around there, maybe 5th. The closest analogy in terms of accomplishments, I think, is Teddy Roosevelt's ascent to power when McKinley was shot, and the stuff and the things that Teddy Roosevelt accomplished during his time, and he had a long run also. Because McKinley was shot fairly early in his term. And so I have a long footnote in my book comparing the accomplishments of Teddy Roosevelt and Truman. And he's very close. And I think he could be ranked equally with Truman. A lot of people say he would be ahead of him, but they're in the same spot. Obviously, Lincoln and Washington and Roosevelt and so forth belong where they are as great presidents. But I think given his background, he was an extraordinary president, and he had confidence. You would think he complained all the time about he didn't know he wasn't prepared, blah blah blah, but he had confidence in his, and he did not let criticism slow him down.
It's fair to say that he was even more confident after he won the presidency on his own in 48.
Yeah.
We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. David Roll, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. What's your question?
What was your first job?
My first job? A lifeguard.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
Concert? Oh, I'm not a big concert gatherer, but would be, I grew up in Detroit, and I didn't stray far from Detroit. So it was the Kingston Trio.
That's it. That's a unique answer. Good for you. Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Oh, I started reading some novels because I got sick of history after a while, and I can't remember her name now, but I can't remember. I have a recent book that was about Appalachia and the spread of drugs, and about an individual who had to fight living in Appalachia, and it gave me a sense of what it was. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the title.
Let me ask a different question that I think would serve you better.
Yeah.
If you could recommend a book, any book on Truman, which book would you recommend, other than yours, of course?
No, I know. I think you have to have McCullough's book because it covers the entire, from the ancestors right up through the end of his life. So it's a complete biography. I think it's like 900 pages. Yeah. And mine has fallen apart. I've read it so much. And he's a wonderful writer, and and he knows how to tell a story. And so I think that will probably always be the fundamental book. I think that there's a lot of Robert Farrell, and there are other authors that have done biographies of him, but I think that McCullough's is the best.
And Jeffrey Frank wrote a book on President Truman, and he came on the Leaders and Legends podcast a couple of years ago.
All right.
Next question. If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Event in history. I think D-Day.
You want to be on the beach or on a ship?
I would want to be safe on the beach. I would like to see the climb up the dunes and getting up to the top. Obviously, very dangerous, but it is, in my sort of life, it is the key thing. I grew up, I was 5 years old at the time, or 4 years old. I've always remembered that.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, just to chat, whom would you choose?
Harry Hopkins.
Living today.
Oh, living today. Okay. Who would I choose? I think have dinner with him.
Yes, sir. Just a 2 hour off the record conversation.
I think Joe Biden before he dies.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been David L. Rohl, prolific author. He's written several best-selling, received history books. Today we discussed Ascent to Power, how Truman emerged from Roosevelt's shadow and remade the world. It's a wonderful read. I have to say, I thought that I knew a lot about this time period, but I definitely learned a few things I didn't know before. Mr. Rohl, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.